listener production.
Hello, welcome to The Briefing. I'm Sasha Barber-Gatt. It is January 26, Australia Day. There will be plenty of people listening who don't recognise or support January 26 as our national day. It is often called Invasion Day, acknowledging the fact British settlers arrived uninvited on this day in 1788. This year's National Day is particularly fraught after the defeat of the Indigenous voice to Parliament last year and the decision by a number of big retailers to stop stocking Australia Day merchandise.
So its emergence, I think, as a kind of focus of some sort of, national symbolism really has been pretty recent. And in retrospect, it might actually be seen as a fairly brief period because it clearly is no longer able to perform that role.
That's coming up shortly, but first, here are today's headlines from our listener newsroom. It is Friday, January 26.
Thanks, Sash. Well, Cyclone Kirrily has crossed the Queensland coast overnight as a Cat 2, leaving some 40,000 homes and businesses without power. The system unexpectedly downgraded from a Cat 3 before making landfall further north of Townsville than first anticipated. Trees were torn sideways as wind gusts of up to 170 k's an hour lashed the coast. Matt Bass from the Weather Bureau says the system is continuing to move inland as a Cat 1 and is expected to downgrade to a low later today.
Hovering around about the strong wind threshold of 25 knots or just below 50 kilometres per hour now. That trend is still for conditions to continue easing. It's well inland now, about 130 kilometres to the west-southwest of Townsville.
If you remember, it comes after Cyclone Jasper lashed north of Cairns just last month as a Cat 2. Moving on to Australia Day news, and two pioneers of melanoma treatment who saved thousands of lives have been named the 2024 Australians of the Year. Professor Georgina Long and Professor Richard Scolyer have received the honour at a ceremony in Canberra. They say the recognition is deeply moving.
We never imagined our life work would lead us here.
We stand here tonight proudly representing every melanoma patient and their families, but also those with brain cancer and indeed all cancers.
Meantime, the controversial day will see thousands gather at events across the country, from smoking ceremonies to music festivals, in solidarity with First Nations people calling for the country's pollies to change the date. Today marks the first Oz Day since the failed voice referendum. And if you want to be rich for 2024, there was no Division 1 winners in last night's Powerball, meaning it'll jackpot to $200 million next week. That'll be the biggest lotto prize in Aussie history.
The debate about Australia Day blows up every year, and the overwhelming rejection of the voice to Parliament in last year's referendum has only made matters more complicated. While acknowledging there are plenty of our listeners who do want the day changed, there is still very strong support to keep Australia Day where it is. So what's the way forward? Frank Bongiorno is a political historian at the Australian National University, and he joins me now to discuss it. Frank, thanks for being here with us today. This was something that I wasn't anticipating to happen. I've always viewed the issues as separate, even though they involve and concern Indigenous Australians. I didn't expect a hangover of the voice debate to be kind of this shift in how we discuss Australia Day. How did the failed voice referendum affect our attitude to January 26?
Well, I think The Voice has produced a kind of backlash politics. But that said, there'd been a pretty vigorous debate about Australia Day, a movement to change the date, really for some years now, probably going back 7 or 8 years, perhaps a bit longer. And the controversies over Australia Day, of course, are much older than that. I think during the pandemic, there was probably a retreat from the issue. People's preoccupations were elsewhere. There was some, obviously, disruption of the kinds of activities that would normally occur on Australia Day on the 26th of January. And so I suppose with the end of the pandemic, there has been a return to some of those kinds of controversies. I think there's also quite an interesting and in some ways surprisingly intimate relationship with public attitudes to Anzac Day, the 25th of April. There's almost a sense in which, during that period around the time of the centenary of the First World War, there was more of a preoccupation with Anzac Day, a sense that it was, a more authentic national National Day perhaps and Australia Day. And then with the end of that centenary period, I think there was a shift back to Australia Day and to a kind of cultural preoccupation with that, and to its drawing into the culture wars, which has obviously been very strong in the last few weeks.
You wrote recently in The Conversation calling the issue a complex debate. Now, the other issue you brought up was the age of Australians. And my question to you is, do you think the idea of sticking with January 26 is predominantly seen in older Australians versus younger Australians?
Yeah, the evidence of that's really clear. I actually did a survey with Darren Penney of the Social Research Centre late 2018, so it was actually before the usual Australia Day change the date season. And the findings of that, 5 years ago, were very clear that there was an overall majority of people wanted to stick with the 26th of January and Australia Day, about 70% in fact we found. But then once you started digging down into different generations, the picture changed really substantially. For millennials, it was about 58%. For Gen Z, it wasn't even a majority, so only 47% basically approved of sticking with the 26th of January. There have obviously been many surveys since then, and they tend to turn up similar sorts of generational differences of that kind. Younger people are much less attached to Anzac Day and to the traditional ways of marking that day than older people are.
Do you think it's down to what kids are being taught in schools? Is there a different kind of curriculum that younger Australians are learning about our Indigenous history more and understanding the impacts of colonisation on the Indigenous people? Or is it more, like you said, these attitude shifts to the way that we celebrate national days? I guess to use the term cringe, a lot of young people might just go, I don't want to be patriotic and weird. It's strange.
Oh, I think the latter is true. A lot of that, sort of very patriotic ritual, the wearing of national colours, all that sort of thing was quite common, back in the 1970s and 1980s. The green and gold or clothing that had an Australian flag on it. But yeah, that's also partly about changing historical consciousness and sensibilities. I went to school in the 1980s. We would have learned, I think, almost nothing about things like frontier violence and relations between settler and Indigenous Australians. I think perhaps till maybe year 11 Australian history, which means most students would have learnt nothing because they wouldn't have done history in those upper years, whereas now I think that it is much more embedded in the curriculum. There are obviously important rituals such as the welcome to country, acknowledgement of country, that students perform themselves at school, that they see teachers and hear teachers and visitors performing. Obviously, public and civic ceremonies have much more explicitly incorporated recognition of Indigenous history and culture. All of that clearly has its impacts on younger people and lesser impacts, I think, on older people who are less subject perhaps to at least some of those sites of ritual.
We've talked about the generation divide, but we also have to talk about the political divide when looking at the issue of Australia Day and the argument to change the date or keep it the same. What lines are we seeing drawn? Is there a clear-cut difference for support when it comes to Conservative voters versus Liberal with a small L voters?
Yeah, the survey that Darren and I did some years ago showed that Liberal National Party voters were much more, coalition voters were much more supportive of Australia Day than Labor Party voters or those who identified as Greens voters. Indeed, Greens voters, only a minority supported Australia Day in the survey we did. If you're looking across the states, there's less support for Australia Day in Victoria than elsewhere, reflecting, I guess, the pattern of more, kind of progressive values that has been reflected in electoral results in Victoria federally and in the states for some years. So those differences are important. Women too are less supportive of Australia Day than men are, again reflecting patterns that we know exist more broadly, where women are more inclined to progressive politics these days. So yeah, those differences exist, and yeah, I think that affects the way in which political sort of dialogue and discourse has occurred.
Research recently asked people to associate 3 words with Australia Day, and the overwhelming favourites were barbecue, celebration and holiday. To me, that sounds like those people involved in that study, at least, weren't associating it with, Australia's colonisation or, white settlement or anything like that. It was more associated with the fact that people got a day off and, they got to celebrate, being in Australia and living in one of the best countries in the world. But given that there's so little acknowledgement of that historical significance, why are we so reluctant to change the date and move it to a day that maybe has more meaning to all of Australia?
Yeah, so there's the historical significance of a day and there's its symbolic significance, isn't there? And I think it's absolutely right that most Australians are probably a bit hazy about what the day actually marks historically. Some people think it's got something or other to do with Captain Cook, which it doesn't. It's obviously to do with the arrival of the First Fleet at Port Jackson at Sydney in 1788. But, a lot of people would be, I think, pretty vague about all of that. But it clearly does have all sorts of symbolic significance. I guess particularly on the political right, there's been a kind of ambition in recent years that it would hold the same kind of civic role as something like Independence Day in the United States or Bastille Day in France. My sense is it can't do that because it's clearly a contentious day. It means something very different for most Indigenous people who see it as a day of mourning and of pain. That particular kind of counter-narrative actually goes a long way back. I mean, it was there in 1938 when Indigenous activists contested Australia Day all the way back then and called for a day of mourning. Was very prominent in the bicentenary of 1988 where, you had millions along Sydney Harbour and you had First Fleet reenactment and you had tall ships and all sorts of celebrations, but you also had protests in Sydney by Indigenous people and their supporters, marches of tens of thousands of people, smoking ceremonies at Kurnell and all the rest of it. So it's been very contested, which means that the kind of symbolic civic weight that people want to attach to it as a kind of day of unity, perhaps comparable with some of those other countries that I mentioned, doesn't seem to work terribly well. And it's had a fairly checkered history too. I mean, it's had a number of names over the years. There have been other dates, of course, which have been called Australia Day and which have been observed as Australia Day, usually in wartime as fundraising activities in July or October. So its emergence, I think, as a kind of focus of some sort of, national symbolism really has been pretty recent, and in retrospect it might actually be seen as a fairly brief period because it clearly is no longer able to perform that role. Certainly from the middle of the 20th century it began to be an occasion for various forms of civic activity, citizenship ceremonies being the classic ones. And so the first of those I'm aware of occurred in January 1949 here in Canberra, where I am at the moment at the Albert Hall. So the recognition that it could be used for that kind of activity came pretty early, sort of as a mid-20th century thing. I mean, that's just after Australian citizenship was legislated for the first time. And of course, in more recent years, it's the day on which you announce Australia Day honours, Australian of the Year. But, there's clearly been a drawing back from that kind of role, reflected especially in the reluctance of a number of municipal councils, local councils, to conduct citizenship ceremonies on that day.
Before we let you go, Frank, how do you see this playing out? The debate's been raging on for years and years. As you said, Indigenous activists protesting on January 26 is nothing new, but we really have seen an increase in that in the last decade or so. Are we going to see movement by a government on this anytime soon?
No, we may not see movement by government. I mean, it's a public holiday and has been observed on the day itself rather than just as a long weekend as it used to be, for some time now. So governments probably won't move drastically on Australia Day. I think what we're much more likely to see is a kind of evolution to something different. So it may still be observed as a holiday. And there may be a much stronger attempt, I think, to insert a kind of more of a reflective aspect to it, particularly around Australia's history of race relations. I think that's likely to come into it. In the past, we've seen attempts to kind of weld it to ideas around multiculturalism and cultural diversity, and that's continued over the years as well. And it may be that, there's a renewed effort in that kind of area as well as a way of kind of salvaging Australia Day. But I can't see governments necessarily turning sharply against it.
No, I can't either, given the debate that continues to rage on. It's hard to make everyone happy, but I guess what I'd hope for is something that maybe unifies us a little bit more rather than divides us. Frank, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us today.
It's been a pleasure, Sasha. Thanks.
That was Frank Bongiorno, a political historian at the Australian National University. Given it is such a contentious issue, it is unlikely any government is going to have the courage to change the date, especially in the wake of the overwhelming rejection of the voice in last year's referendum. That's all we have time for, but in the meantime, we would love to hear your thoughts on this topic. You can send us a message, or even better, send us a voice message on Instagram. We might even play your response on a future episode. I'm Sasha Barbagat. Thanks for listening.
Listener.